works. So we finished World War II. Now we're looking at the period of the 1950s. This is the great period of nostalgia. Most people my age, even a little bit younger, and of course everybody older, they look back at this great period in history, the 1950s, leading up to the 60s, and then culminating in 1969 with the landing on the moon. And then from then on, everything goes downhill, which really the downhill begins in the 80s, but that's neither here nor there. But this is the period of nostalgia. This is the period that everybody's looking forward to, wanting to be like. This is the happy days. It wasn't necessarily the greatest time, but there were advantages at that period. We had the largest growing middle class. We had prosperity like we had never had before, and it wasn't just all going to one group. It was across the board. More people lived better than their parents and their grandparents in the 1950s than at any other time in our history. So let's go into the 1950s.
When the new year rang in on January 1st, 1950, America's population was 151,684,000 people. The average yearly salary was $2,992. In the labor force, 2 women worked for every 5 men. But women lived longer, 71.1 years, to men's 65.6. Over 6.6 million cars were sold in 1950. That number would double by the end of the decade. The cost of a loaf of bread was 14 cents. A gallon of gas was 18 cents. The 50s was the decade of change in America. The rise of the middle class, suburbia, and building the interstate highway system. The 50s can be captured in just a few words which speak volumes: the Cold War and the Red Scare. This was the decade where people built bomb shelters. If you were born in the 50s, you are a baby boomer, the most influential and powerful group of Americans ever born. The 50s began with Democrat Harry Truman as president, and electricity was generated from nuclear power for the first time. Milk was still delivered to the doorstep. And 8 million homes in the U.S. owned televisions.
We've talked a lot in this class about economic advancements and different economic situations that have happened, whether it's the Depression or whether it's the prosperity of the 1950s. And really, I want to show you this particular graph because you can see that throughout the 19th century, essentially the economy was fairly stable. Money increased in value a little bit over time, and people did a little better. Starting in the 1900s, the beginning of the 20th century, you see that we've already begun to move up, and this is a result of industrialization. This is increased market supply. This is the beginning of the consumer society, and as more people buy things, as more people invent new things and new products come to market, the economy begins to grow. And we see this crash here in 1929, and then we begin to see the rise. There's the rise through the first the New Deal and then the war, and then a little bit of drop off right afterwards, and then basically a straight line up with some recessions happening at various and sundry times throughout the past 60, 70, 80 years, but the majority of it has been a drive up. It doesn't mean that people have that their wages have increased. It means that the economy and all the GDP, the gross, basically what we produce as a country has increased significantly over the years. And I love to show this picture because this is a picture that was in, I believe it was Look magazine, immediately after the war, and it's a wonderful example of really this new prosperity. We'd gone through the Depression, which was essentially rationing. During the war, there was massive rationing, and so we come out of the war. Suddenly, we have people who are working. we have factories and farms that are producing, and we have just this huge expansion. And this is what one family would consume, basically from the grocery store, in a single year. Productivity goes way up. Our factories are humming. Essentially, Europe has no manufacturing capacity at this point, either does Japan. And so we really are the one and only bastion of manufacturing. Now, that will change as Germany and France and England and Japan rebuild their industries, and especially Germany and Japan. By the time we get to the 1970s, they've surpassed us because they have all brand new factories. We're still working in factories that some of them were built before World War I, and they've been modernized, they've been upgraded, but essentially we're working with an inventory of older manufacturing capabilities. At the same time, we're providing newer technology and newer abilities to our former enemies in World War II, who, like I said, by the 70s are really, especially in automotive and electronics, are really giving us a run for our money. Marshall Plan. Following the war, a lot of men came back and entered the workforce. And many of these men all of these men had a significant amount of military training. They knew how to work within a chain of command. They knew how to delegate to the people below them. They knew how to be accountable to the people above them. And this was perfect for a new culture, a new business culture that is very regimented, very stratified, essentially taking the ideas of the military and then superimposing them on a workforce. And we see a huge expansion in business. Just of people who, like I said, had been at the war and now are able to really approach business from a much more structural point of view. The flow chart suddenly becomes important because you got to know who to report to. And it's also really the invention of the man in the gray flannel suit. This is that great washed, uniform, homogeneous 50s culture of the man in the business suit. And I love this example. This is taken from men coming off the subway in New York. And I can actually ascertain, based on what these men are wearing and how they're wearing it and how they're presenting themselves, where they are in the corporate structure. So you will see there's dead center at the very bottom. You'll see a guy that doesn't even have a tie on. He has an open shirt. He's got a raincoat on, double-breasted raincoat on. It would be very safe to say that this is a manual laborer. This is not someone going to an office. He doesn't have a hat on, which is very, very rare in the 1950s, and he doesn't have a tie on, and he's out in public. That's very, if you notice, even half the women, there are two women, you can see part of it there, even the women are wearing scarves. Headgear was very common right up through the 1960s. You'll see the gentleman right behind that person wearing a dark raincoat. Well, the darker the raincoat, probably the lower within the hierarchy of corporate America that person is sitting, because a dark raincoat isn't going to show stains as easily as a light-colored, especially a camel-colored raincoat. And so this is probably a middle manager, maybe up to the very top of middle management, but he's yet to reach the higher echelons. Those are the guys standing next to him in the very light-colored coats, because they can afford to get those dry cleaned. Most of them are probably cashmere. They're probably very, very expensive coats. And you can see, based on just on the outerwear, the status of the men that are here. If you look at the man with the darkest jacket, you'll see he's kind of wearing a little floppy hat. The guy next to him wearing the lighter coat, he has a much more substantial fedora, more expensive hat, more expensive coat. He comes from a higher social class than the guy standing next to him. But again, unless you were to split out the little differences between these and be able to try to ascertain the class differences, you look at this and it's a pretty homogeneous, racially and ethnically, it's, it is what it is. But this is a period where there's a pent-up demand for product. there also is a great deal of experience now in the realm of propaganda. Some of the guys that did propaganda in World War II had actually begun working on propaganda in World War I, between the wars, in that little bit of time when there was some prosperity. Many of them worked in advertising. I showed you some of the early ads in an earlier lecture. But here we are at a point where really everything comes together, and the media is expanding, so there are new ways to advertise, new ways to sell things. And really, I remember I showed you a picture earlier of a Cadillac factory making Jeeps. This is now, not Jeeps, tanks in that particular case. This is now a period when those desires, the dreams for the material that was unavailable, the products that were unavailable during the war, they're now available, and people are working, and people have money, and they can buy these things. And so a lot of the consumer culture that you would recognize today, except for maybe the sale of cigarettes, or the marketing of cigarettes, but much of the advertising world, the self-image of America, is forged in these periods of general prosperity and upward mobility and the availability of product. It changes the entire world. And so here you see, this isn't just a picture of trying to sell a refrigerator. This is, look at the amount of stuff that is jammed into that refrigerator. You couldn't find anything, right? This is essentially a supermarket crammed into a little box in your kitchen. But again, this is the way that Americans view themselves, as we're in a time of prosperity. I know this film for this weird margarine package next to it is kind of strange, but during the war it wasn't legal to sell yellow margarine. It had to be white, because there were people that were trying to profiteer by faking it, by putting food coloring into just fat, just grease, and selling it as butter. And so it was illegal to sell yellow margarine during the war. Now all of a sudden you can the margarine came with dye packets, and you would squeeze it and mix it and get it so that it would be yellow. Later they just marketed it they just sold it as yellow. But as they began to transition from the war into the 50s, these types of little weird anomalies were going on. And I love this kitchen. This is really the kitchen of the future. I know the things is in full color and then the picture's in black and white, but that's just the way it was. But if you look carefully at this picture, you'll notice that it's just a corner here, and there's a work stool. If you notice under the window, there's a part that's been lifted up. That's actually the sink. The sink is under a cover that goes over the top of the entire counter, so you have a completely unbroken counter space, and then you lift up several sections. And so under the window you see the sink next to the oven, which has got a big glass door so you can watch all your food cook. There's the stove. You can lift that up. Of course, if you leave that down with the stove on, it'll burn your house down. All of the cupboards have glass doors, so you can see what's in them. You don't have to even remember. I love the fact that there's even a pair of slippers stuck under the sink on there. It's just, all in all, it's just a fascinating vision that didn't actually come to fruition, but it's how Americans were trying to re-envision who they were, what we were, how we wanted to live, what the future should look like. The 50s was more about the future than it was about the present. And one of the big things, of course, to happen is the introduction of television, and really establishing it as our primary form of communication and information exchange. And understand that we start off with just a few television sets, and most people don't have television. Radio at this point is everything. Everything that will come onto television had to start in radio. Comedies, game shows, talk shows, educational shows, even taking full-length movies and performing them on radio before television existed was a very common practice. And with that, with the rise of the television, we got our first TV dinner, our first really instant foods. There had been a few foods you could just add water to before this, pudding and a few others. but all of a sudden you can get an entire meal put together by professional chefs, and it's an instant meal. You just pop it in the oven for 45 to 50 minutes, depending on how many you're cooking, and you can have a choice of 5 flavors. You can have sliced turkey, sliced chicken, roast beef, Salisbury steak, meatloaf. The turkey meal, of course, the dressing was just croutons with gravy. The vegetables were pretty horrible. Later on, they actually added another compartment between the 2 veg, which had a dessert, either a brownie or an apple brown Betty. All nasty, all horrible to eat, but it was marketed as a way to get food on the table quickly and easily. This is the space age, and the fact that it only took 45 minutes to heat it up, this is pre-microwave, was astonishing. And it allowed people to pick and choose the meal they had, so that not all people in the family had to eat exactly the same meal. Was it successful? Yeah. I mean, go look at the frozen food department now. Right now, the most the area of groceries that is selling the most and is the most rapidly expanding part of the whole grocery store marketing thing is not on pre-fixed dinners like these, although there's a huge market for that. The most rapidly growing one is where you just add 1 or 2 ingredients and still cook it yourself. Initially, when cake mixes came on the market, all you had to do was add water. And people didn't feel they were really baking. They were just adding water and shoving it in the oven. So that's why they modified the recipes to where you have to add oil, or maybe you add oil, egg, and water. So you add more than just the water. It can all be done with just adding water, but people want to have the feeling that they're doing the baking, and so they have to add a few other ingredients. And the same with the meals that are now becoming very, very popular. It might be all the vegetables and the seasoning and the sauce mix, and you just add your chicken, or it might be a little cup where you just put an egg in it and skirt it up, put it in the microwave, and have a breakfast. So all of these things have their roots back in the 1950s. And so these numbers are almost laughable now. In the 1950s, the average daily television view was about 4 hours, up to about 5 hours in 1960, about almost 6 hours by 1970. I don't know about your house, but I don't even know how you would measure this, because between our phones, our laptops, our desktops, our televisions, all of which are showing television-oriented material, or that. I mean, what is the definition of television today? Is a YouTube channel the same as an NBC channel? 10 years ago, I would have said no. Today, I would have said I don't know. Actually, our media is changing, our media is expanding, our world is changing, and one of the reasons we look at the history is to see how we adapted to other things in the past. And you can see that television kind of creeps its way in and then takes over. And the same thing happens with the internet and other media as well. Along with the rise of television comes the rise of television advertising, and this becomes the big impetus to grow television. Is the fact that initially we only have 3 networks. By the time we get to from say 1961 through 1980, every home has 3 networks max. Some places like Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco might have a few independent channels. We got our first non-network channel here in the Valley around the 1980s, when Channel 26 came on the air, and it's now an affiliate of a network, because there are now 5 networks, but there used to only be 3. It was independent, and they didn't even own any cameras. Everything that they showed was either pre-taped, or when they would host spooky movies, or they do the community calendar or something like that, it would be just somebody reading over a title card. And so that was our first foray into non-network TV here in the San Joaquin Valley. But that was kind of common everywhere. And like I said, there'd be a few independents in Los Angeles or San Francisco or places like that, but the majority of the country had just 3 networks, which meant that we all watched the same news, and there were laws meaning that news had to be factual. You couldn't make stuff up and call it news. If you stated an opinion, then you had to allow that same amount of time for everyone with differing opinions. And so most broadcasters were very, very neutral. And the news was very, very neutral. These are the facts. This is what happened. There was very little of this is what it means for my political party. And that's a huge change over the last 50 years, that our media has gone from newspapers that were, on the editorial side, partisan, but on the news side, very neutral, to television and radio that started out by law being neutral, and now has transitioned to where it's very, very partisan, and both sides, even the side that you may agree with, probably some portion of it is guided by spin rather than by fact. And so the nature has changed a lot, but in the 50s this opens up a whole new realm of advertising and the exchange of ideas that we've never had before, and we really see how powerful television advertising will become. One of the areas in which it has a huge impact is expanding the market for televangelism. During the 1920s, of course, we had radio evangelists who were very, very powerful. And now, as we move into the 50s, they move into television. And these are some of Billy Graham and some of the others that had early television shows that built huge, the Joel Osteens of their age, these huge mega churches, huge online audiences or over-the-air audiences listening to these syndicated programs across the country, really impacting public thought throughout the nation. One of the biggest shifts is a shift in population distribution, and this has to do with the fact that coming out of the war we have the GI Bill. We've talked about that a little bit, and we'll talk more about it, but the GI Bill gives all returning soldiers and sailors a guarantee of a low-cost, long-term mortgage. Prior to the 1950s, most homes were purchased on 7-year mortgages, and most people were able to pay them off in 7 years. And so 7 years after you buy the house, you own it. With the GI Bill, one of the things that it introduces is it gives you a long payback, so 30 years. But what that does is that drops the payment way down, and it makes buying a house much more affordable than it had been prior to the war. Now, the 30-year mortgage has become the norm, which is kind of bad because the average time that anybody lives in any house is about 7 years. And so most of us, when you're buying a house, you haven't paid off the interest before you sell the house again. And so you hope, as long as the value of the house continues to go up year after year, that's fine. But if it doesn't increase or it decreases in value in that 7 years, you have no equity in the home. You've sold it for just basically, hopefully, recouping some of the interest that you've paid. So basically, most people who quote unquote own homes in the United States are actually just renting the homes from their bank. But understand that this does mean that we build 11 million new suburban homes immediately after the war, and that is huge. That means, think of all the crews that have to build those homes. Think of all of the people in the factories who are building those 11 million couches and those 22 million beds and those 22 million bedside tables and the 22 million dressers and all of the things that are needed for that single-family home prior to the 1950s. And even into the 50s and 60s, but it diminishes to the point of going away. Single people didn't move out of their family home into either a full-blown one-bedroom or two-bedroom apartment or into a house. They would leave their family home and go into either a hotel. Hotels that were set up just for women. Others were set up just for men. They weren't even co-ed at that point. And so they had residence hotels that were divided by gender. There were homes like boarding houses where a family might own a house with a bunch of bedrooms, an old Victorian, and they would rent the bedrooms out to individuals and provide the meals for them 2-3 times a day. And that's how most people lived. Or they might even live in a studio apartment with a Murphy bed that came out of the wall or something like that. But the idea, the notion of I turn 18, I go get a one-bedroom apartment, I'm out on my own, I'm going to have my own household, that's relatively new. And it begins in the 50s as part of the consumerism. Building all these homes, we're making all this stuff, it's patriotic to move out. Today, that isn't the case. We can't really afford it. And most people are realizing now that there's really little purpose to just move out on your own. It makes economic sense to stay in the family home longer and longer, which is why we've extended the medical insurance up to age 26, which up to this point still exists. And we see a part of this shift that comes with these 11 million new homes, as well as new developments in the inner cities. We begin to see a shift that is continuing today and is kind of created part of the division in this country. If you notice in the 1940 census that the majority of Americans, over 50%, almost 60%, the majority of Americans live in rural areas or small towns. By 1950, that number has shifted and more people have moved into the suburbs. If you look all the way across 1940 through 1970, and these trends will continue. The number of people living in the central cities drops. The number of people living in suburbs increases, and the number of people living in rural areas and small towns decreases. That process, that trend is continuing today to where there are fewer and fewer people living in rural areas and small towns. There are fewer and fewer people living in the small central states, the flyover states, and population is concentrating in coastal areas, which have much nicer weather, of course, and in urban areas where there's more diversity, there's more opportunity as far as jobs. The places I grew up back in North Dakota, it used for generations, it would be, well, the oldest son would inherit his father's farm and then the rest of the kids would go off and find work elsewhere. Most of the farms, even in the Midwest now, are corporate farms. They're not owned by individuals. They're not even being passed down family to family. So basically, even they're using fewer and fewer workers because the farms are bigger and bigger and bigger. They're more automated. People are not farmers; they're farm workers, and it's a huge change. And so we see a concentration of people in coastal cities and coastal areas like California, Oregon, Washington, the whole eastern seaboard, and really a hollowing out of the middle part of the country, which affects our politics considerably because we don't have a true democracy. We have a democracy that tends to balance or offset true democracy with minority rule in many cases. The Electoral College is set up that way. The Senate is set up that way. So, for example, there are fewer people in North Dakota than there are in Fresno, and yet they have 2 senators and a congressman. We have 2 congressmen here in Fresno and 2 senators for the entire state. We have a population equal to that of Canada, and yet we only have 2 senators. So we do not live in a democracy. Don't ever let anyone tell you that we do. We have some democratic aspects to our society, but land is actually more powerful than people. The geography in our particular form of democracy has more power than large numbers of people. It's just the way it is. You can change it. It'd take a while to change it, but you got to, it is what it is. As is often the case in U.S. history, much of what we talk about as progress or advances in any particular period generally tends to impact one group more than another. And this is true with the expansion into the suburbs following World War II. Essentially, and Levittown, the reason I have this up here is that Levittown's probably the greatest example of this, and that is that the majority of those 11 million suburban homes that we built were built in restricted neighborhoods. They were whites only. Levittown, of course, is in New Jersey. There were Levittowns all over the world, and they were all white. But the Levittown in New Jersey, for example, which is where Bill O'Reilly, who was a very conservative commentator, very popular until a couple of years ago when the Me Too movement kind of put him out of business. But he grew up there, and it reflects in his view of the world that whites are superior to all others, and that what makes America great is what makes America white. And we find this not just in the South, but throughout the entire country. The majority of these suburbs, even here in Fresno, were exclusive. They were for one way or another, either through restrictive covenants or other measures. And really, this is the vision of America that grows up. This is there was even a very popular song in the early 1960s by a singer named Doris Day, where it said they're little boxes, all in a row. They're all wrapped up in ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same. And that really was describing the America that was growing in the 50s and 60s of these suburbs. Go look anything north of Belmont, and you'll see neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood of almost identical homes. Maybe they'll flip them and run them down, or maybe there'll be 2 or 3 different plans throughout the neighborhood. But essentially, the assembly line builds neighborhoods where a crew will come in and lay out the utilities, and then they'll come in and pour the concrete slab, and then they'll come in, another crew will come in and put in all of the framing, and as they move down the block, you can see each crew as they move down, and then so they come in and they put the roof on, and then they do the interior, and each step is done by a crew that does just that one job, and they move down. And that's how suburbs are built even today. This is actually Levittown. Again, this could be just about anywhere in America. This looks a lot like the area around McLean High School, for example. Identical houses, street after street. Everybody wanting to be the same and yet to be individual. And it just keeps growing and expanding and getting worse. And one of the byproducts of that, of course, is what we refer to as car culture. As people move out of the inner cities, it doesn't mean that their jobs move out of the cities. People are still working in the cities, but living in these suburbs on the edges, sometimes 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 miles. San Bernardino is a suburb of Los Angeles. It's 60 miles from Upland, Ontario, so another 10 miles. So it's 70 miles from San Bernardino to downtown Los Angeles, and yet people live in San Bernardino and commute into downtown or even farther onto the west side. When I worked at UCLA, I had many colleagues who lived as far away as Orange County, or lived in San Bernardino County, or lived up in Ventura County. And they would commute in, which meant that they used their car. And beginning in the 1950s, we start to see the rise of car culture. This is where the drive-in is invented. This is where the drive-through is invented with In-N-Out hamburgers. And their menu hasn't changed much. The prices have changed, but that's about it. And in fact, the history of Southern California can be told by looking at burgers. I actually played a film from my California history class that examines the growth of Los Angeles and the growth of the hamburger, and uses that. And as I've said many times, you can study history from a lot of different ways. And so you can look at the rise of the fast food joint as Los Angeles expands and the suburbs become more important and the inner city becomes the place of money, but the living is on the edges. You see, not in downtown, but in the transitionary locations, in the areas between the suburbs and the downtown. That's where you start to see these fast food joints grow, and then they move out into the suburbs, and then they work their way back in. I always show this picture to every class and go, where is this? And this is, of course, a picture taken from looks like the late 60s, early 70s. No, it's actually from the 70s, looking at the cars. But this is pretty indicative of just about anywhere. Where is this? Is this Blackstone? Is this Mooney down in Visalia? Is this 7th Avenue or 11th Avenue in Hanford? No, this happens to be, I think, in Reno, but it really doesn't matter. I mean, the chain franchises are the chain franchises. The neon is the neon. The same is the same. And really, we by the time we get to starting in the 50s and then accelerating up into about the 1970s, a lot of the things that made different American regions unique have kind of disappeared, and we're living in a much more generic American consumerism culture. With the rise of the 50s, with the strength of the unions, at this point 60% of the workforce is unionized, as opposed to today where less than 10% is unionized. It is the union that gives you the weekend, it gives you paid vacation, it gives you a lot of things that we no longer have, we've given up. But in the 50s, that 2 or 3 weeks of guaranteed paid vacation every year, the mortgage that keeps the prices down so you have the stability of a home, and consumer credit, which allows you to buy things like cars and go off and pay for motels or buy a travel trailer. Well, this is all really kind of coming into existence in the 1950s as the middle class and the working class now have access to some leisure time. I was told when I was growing up that I would need to have leisure activities, hobbies and things like that, because when I reached adulthood, we would be so much more productive than we were when I was growing up, that we'd be able to work 15 hours a week and produce everything that we could do in 40 hours then. And while that is true, we no longer get paid for the 40, we only get paid for the 15. And so we've seen all of the transfer of wealth go from the middle class to the top over the last 50 years, primarily because we've lost unions and we've lost someone who can actually be a voice for the working class. But in the 50s, we had a great deal of mobility and leisure time and health benefits we hadn't had before and retirement benefits we haven't had before. They really come into the American psyche here in the 1950s. So much so that, and as I said, cars play a huge role in this. By say 1940, there are a couple of dozen drive-in theaters in the country. By the time we reach the 1950s, there are in the thousands, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 drive-ins. That will dwindle. In the 70s is kind of the last of it. Today, there are only a few. If you get a chance, go to drive up to Madera. They still have a drive-in there. It's not one of the best. The screen is not the most reflective. It's actually made out of corrugated painted white. It's not a highly reflective surface, but it works. And it kind of harkens back to a period where we used to pile into the car. We'd get as many people in because it was per carload, and so we would get lots and lots of people in. We'd sometimes take in our own food. Of course, teenagers used it as a place to make out. Many children were conceived in the back seat of somebody's car at the drive-in. I know when I was in high school, we used to go to the drive-in even when it was foggy, and you could actually see the projector being bounced off the fog as it was on its way to the screen as it was going. But we didn't care. It was the drive-in. If you remember when we talked about World War II, and I showed you a map of all of the bases, and I know we looked at maps as internment camps and other things, but one of the maps I showed you was a map of all the military bases, and you notice that I pointed out at the time that the majority of them were in the south and along the borders, and lots of them in the west. And we see a shift right after the war that will continue through the 50s, through the 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s. And it's a slightly different pattern now, but it really will continue for decades after the end of World War II, of people leaving the cold parts of the country and the barren parts like North Dakota and Minnesota, where I grew up, South Dakota, those Midwestern empty places, those cold places around Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and those areas. While the cities have seen some growth, so we've seen the rural to urban growth, the majority of the growth has been to the west and to the south. And you can see, states like California and Arizona and Nevada and Florida have had, doubled or quadrupled in population between 1950 and 1980. Look at the amount of growth, the difference in population between 1950 and 1980 just in Los Angeles. Remember, I told you when we were talking about World War II, and especially when we were talking about the Zoot Suit riots, I pointed out that at the beginning of the war, Los Angeles was not much bigger than Fresno is today, and that it was World War II and the population influx that came after that accounts for the growth. It wasn't the movie industry that built Los Angeles, although it still is probably one of the biggest economic drivers of the community. It was World War II that built Los Angeles. You really can't deny that. It's just a fact of life. if we were in class, I would say, what do you think the name of this program is? This is a TV show. And you would, most of you, if you knew anything of 50s TV, would say Leave It to Beaver, which is similar but not the same. And this is actually a show that began on radio and then migrated to television and ran for many, many years. And it was called Father Knows Best. Talk about misogyny. Father Knows Best, right? Here, and look at the picture here, and you get an idea of the attitude, especially of 50s white males, towards the rest of the world, right? Here, Dad is sitting in the middle. His two older children are sitting at the table. They're obviously, they have plates. The younger child, there's a plate over on this side of the table, which is probably, down in the front. If you look at the very bottom of the picture, you'll see that the little girl has gone around to see whatever it is that Father's pointing out in the newspaper. Mom doesn't have a table. Mom doesn't even have a place setting. There is no place for the mother to sit. So here's the mother. She's got an apron on, but she's got jewelry fully made up. Her hair is perfect. Dinner is on the table for her charges, but she isn't even allowed a seat at that table. And so I think it's a really good illustration of, this is that 50s world that Donald Trump and his ilk want to go back to, where men are in charge, where their whites are in charge, where everyone, whether it's the wife, the children, the people outside the home, all basically kowtow to the superior white male, so-called superior white male. And we begin to see ourselves not as urban Americans. If you look at radio programs of the 60s, they're either very, very rural, or prior to the 60s, even comic strips, very, very rural or very, very urban. This new invention, the suburb, really is defined in the 50s. It's put on our television shows in tons and tons of situation comedies, all middle class, all white, almost always. It's very funny because there are very few single... One of the things that was interesting about 50s and 60s, and even early 70s TV is there are very few single moms, lots of single dads. Which is ironic because there were lots of single moms. There were families where the husband didn't return from World War II or from Korea, and there were single children from those. There were children that were born without, the sanctity of marriage, and yet what's being depicted are white males, almost always with a servant, sometimes male, sometimes female, and raising their children. It's a situation that did not exist for 99.9% of Americans. And yet that was one of the ways we viewed ourselves. It was actually womanless. But as I said before, one of the problems with the growth of the suburb is that it is exclusive. If you live in a home that was built in this city before 1965, find the deed. And if you read through it, you'll find a section that will be labeled covenants, and it will list all of the groups of peoples who cannot live in that house ever. Now, it's no longer legally binding, but it was until 1965. And it will have people of African descent, it'll have Mongols and Asiatics and all kinds of terms that we don't even use today. But you'll see that unless you're white, you really can't live anywhere other than West Fresno, which is why today West Fresno still remains, the heavily black neighborhood, and southeast Fresno is primarily heavily Hispanic because they weren't as restricted as the rest of the city. This tract is exclusive and restricted. You see this on the screen in front of you. That is not in the South. That is actually a Los Angeles suburb. And you see this African-American gentleman looking at the sign knowing that he can never buy one of those lovely single-family homes that's being built in this new suburb. And while we're building new suburbs for white people, in the inner cities, we are tearing them down a lot of what already exists, and we call this urban renewal, and what we're building instead is rentals, either public housing units or private units, but these are not for purchase, these are for rent, which begins a process that we see still going on today, whereas white families, in the 1950s, the majority of white families were able to acquire property and wealth in the United States primarily, but worldwide generally, wealth is tied directly to the ownership of property. So for most white families that have been here since, say, the 1950s, there's wealth. There's intergenerational wealth. Now, there may not be a lot of it, but each generation that owns their own home, they're able to then take that equity, if nothing else, and pass that on to the next generation. So each generation gets a little bump. If you're talking about African Americans and Hispanics in this country, the majority of them through the 1950s were living in rentals, and many of them are still living in rentals and still unable to buy property because of the economy. But starting in the 50s, blacks are primarily concentrated in rentals in the inner cities, which by the 70s then becomes, we have this bad inner city crime problem because we are overcrowding, poor conditions, poor families, an absolute disaster. But we were able to really build the two Americas. We build a different, we desegregate our schools officially, although they're more segregated today than they were in 1954 when Brown v. Board of Education was passed down. We officially desegregated our schools, but we continued to and accelerated the segregation of our communities. People of color, inner cities, rentals, white people, suburbs, and home ownership. That has huge impact to today. So again, if you're white, you see the 50s. The 50s are this period of shiny chrome and space age. Look at this house of the future. This is what they expected houses in the 80s and 90s would look like. We're to be completely self-contained. Our yards would be climate controlled. We could drive right in our nuclear-powered cars that we didn't use any gasoline, and we drive into the bubble where we would have built-in swimming pools and sandboxes where our kids could play even if it was raining outside because it was climate controlled in our lovely home, and everything was open and airy and spacious, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. None of that has happened. We still pretty much live the way we did in 1920 in many respects. This map I really want to show you because I think it's super, super important. This was the highway systems in the 1930s. This was how you could get around. That's 99 running up through the middle of the state of California. That's 1 over on the other side. Actually, that's 101. 99 doesn't run through there. That's 101. Texas has a few roads. But you can see Chicago, Detroit, Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, New York, the eastern seaboard and the upper industrial Midwest. Those cities are pretty well connected. The rest of the country is connected by trains. There's a train that goes up through the Dakotas and across to Washington. There's 2 trains, one that goes through Texas and across the south, another one that goes through more the middle that comes to Sacramento. So we do have a few trains, but really if you want to get from one side of the country to the other, your only option is to get to a major metro area and then get on a train and then ride to the rest of the country. And if you remember when I talked about World War II, I mentioned that Dwight Eisenhower had put the tanks on the Autobahn, which was built by Hitler, the first freeway built by Hitler, to try to race the Russians to get to into Germany to get the surrender. And we lose that. The Russians actually beat us there. But it is at that moment that Dwight Eisenhower realizes that in the United States, what would happen if we were invaded from outside? If we were invaded through Mexico, we were invaded through the West Coast, if we were invaded through the South, there really is no easy way, with the exception of the railroads, which were extensive but not super available, for us to move material and military personnel to those areas and to try to cover the entire country, whether we were invaded from the north, the south, the east, or the west. We really would have difficulty getting stuff there without some changes. And so it is during the 1960s that we built the Interstate Highway System, where we take that map and we completely rework it. By 1970, we've linked all of the major cities, all of the major regions of the country with major 4-lane or bigger highways and freeways from one end of the country to the other. And now we have the logistical ability to be mobile without reliance on just trains. So we have a road system that allows us to not only move commerce and move people, but in the event of an attack from outside, we're able to move the military anywhere in our part of the continent that we need to get to in pretty quickly. This is a little clearer map, and it's got more labels on it, so you can kind of see where things are. but actually that was 5, not 101. Why do I not know my California roads? I apologize. That is Interstate 5. 101 is an interstate, but actually it isn't anymore. It's just a state road, as is 1, as is 99. 99 was supposed to become an interstate, but for some reason it didn't. But that's okay. I've driven 10 across to, let's see, as far as Texas, and then up, and I don't even see it all here. Anyway, I've driven some of those roads. In addition to tearing down much of the inner cities and building rentals, also many of the cities were impacted with the building of the freeways. In the West Coast, the majority of the freeways run through the city. That's true of some of the eastern seaboard cities as well. When you get to the Midwest, industrial Midwest primarily, they change the way they build them, and the freeways wrap around the inner city and then come in like spokes into that wheel, and then you can go around the inner part of the city on that loop. This is actually, I've forgotten what city this is, but this is an urban renewal project where they're just tearing down this swath of the city and building the freeway, which has a major impact because it divides neighborhoods. It splits neighborhoods. It tears out sometimes the core of a neighborhood, leaving either the fringes or the two neighborhoods on either side disconnected. And so this also has a huge problem in changing the way in which we live in this country. And car culture, which we were still kind of talking about, has such an impact that by 1954, the Optimist Club of Los Angeles has a big dinner, and the theme of the dinner is why wait till 1955? We might not even be alive. This is the Optimist Club of Los Angeles, and the reason that they're all wearing gas masks isn't because they're worried about war. This is smog. Our air is killing people in the 50s. This is why we have the Clean Air Act in the late 60s. This is why much of the country today has clean air. The worst air in the country now, of the 10 worst cities worst regions in the country for air quality, 5 of those top 10 are the San Joaquin Valley, and part of that is our geography, but a lot of it is our politics, and so. A lot has changed. You go to Los Angeles today, and on the smoggiest day, you can still see pretty clearly because there are no days as bad as it used to be when 1,500 people a year would die in Los Angeles just from the smog. And that pretty much wraps up the 50s, at least this part of it.